Introduction: the hologram and the master frequency. The three-dimensional universe is not a chaotic battlefield, nor is it a sanctuary that rewards the exhausted. It is a flawless, mathematically perfect electromagnetic server. For generations, the ordinary human has been violently indoctrinated into the cult of friction. They look at the towering barriers of their society, the financial monopolies, the inaccessible elites, the rigid geopolitical hierarchies, and they believe that the only way to conquer them is through the brute force of the analog body. They sweat, they network, they push against the solid concrete walls of their own limitations, bleeding their finite kinetic energy into a system specifically designed to consume them. They proudly wear their exhaustion as a badge of honor, calling this tragedy hard work. This is the acoustic blindness of the masses. It is the delusion of the powerless. It is the superstition of a broken antenna trying to change the global broadcast by physically punching the radio dial. The master operator completely rejects the primitive mechanics of the herd. He understands that the physical reality surrounding him, the neon cavern, is merely a delayed holographic projection. It is the slow, rendered output of a dominant frequency. You do not alter the hologram by fighting the projection. You alter the hologram by hacking the electromagnetic source code. In this definitive transmission, we will permanently assassinate the romance of struggle. We will amputate the spiritual dross and the motivational garbage from your operating system. We will replace the pathetic, trembling concept of hope with the cold, dictatorial physics of quantum telecommunications. We will instruct you in the architecture of acoustic entrainment, the absolute impermeability of the Faraday perimeter, and the lethal simultaneous precision of quantum multiplexing. You will learn that extreme wealth, sovereign power, and absolute authority are not physical objects to be hunted in the dark. They are specific bandwidths in the quantum field. They are pristine frequencies that simply demand to be tuned. If your existence is currently plagued by scarcity, crisis, and noise, it is strictly because your biological hardware is stuck on the default frequency of the hive. You are passively receiving the static of the terrified majority. It is time to break the solder. You are about to transition from a saturated, panicked receiver into the supreme, isolated transmission tower of your own inevitable destiny. Silence the external noise. Isolate your circuits. The calibration of your supremacy begins exactly now. Chapter 1. The Demise of the Receiver. Severing the default frequency of the hive. The idolatry of the internal monologue is the most pathetic, structurally devastating cognitive hallucination ever suffered by the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he navigates the three-dimensional operational grid of the neon cavern. He has been systematically indoctrinated by a civilization of biological automatons to believe in the absolute sanctity of his own thoughts. When a wave of anxiety paralyzes his nervous system, when the terror of poverty grips his chest, or when a sudden urge to consume cheap digital garbage overtakes his focus, the slave assumes full authorship of these phenomena. He says, "I am worried." He says, "I am afraid." He says, "I desire this." He believes that his cranial vault is a secure, isolated safe room where original ideas are independently forged. He is convinced that he is the sovereign author of his own misery. He is fundamentally illiterate in the basic physics of radio frequency engineering. The human mind, in its default untrained state, is not a secure vault. It is not an isolated generator of original thought. The biological brain of the ordinary man is a cheap, mass-produced, unshielded dipole antenna. To assume absolute dictatorial control over your reality, you must strip away the romance of human consciousness and examine yourself through the cold, unfeeling lens of telecommunications. In radio engineering, a naked dipole antenna is the most primitive, defenseless receiving mechanism in existence. It possesses zero selectivity. It possesses no electromagnetic shielding. It is violently exposed to the elements, condemned to passively absorb every single stray frequency, background static, and ambient transmission that drifts through the local atmosphere. The 200 Hz biomass is a crawling legion of naked antennas. They do not generate thoughts, they download them. The fears, the mediocre ambitions, the outrage, and the pathetic compromises that flood the mind of the slave are not his own. They are the default frequency of the hive. The neon cavern is not a physical location. It is a dense, suffocating, overlapping grid of aggressive carrier waves broadcasted continuously by the architecture of the matrix. The news cycles, the algorithmic feeds, the economic panic, the desperate conversations of the herd, these are high-wattage transmitters. They broadcast the frequency of scarcity. They broadcast the frequency of submission. They broadcast the exact geometric coordinates of mediocrity, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Because the slave operates with an unshielded antenna, he is forcibly tuned to this public broadcast. When he wakes up at 3:00 a.m. in a cold sweat, agonizing over his financial survival, he is not experiencing an original psychological crisis. His biological antenna has simply intercepted the ambient carrier wave of global economic terror. His nervous system demodulates the signal, translates it into cortisol, and projects the illusion of an original thought onto his prefrontal cortex. He is a hijacked receiver playing someone else's music, entirely convinced he composed the symphony. The architect of the now looks at this cybernetic slavery with absolute sociopathic boredom. The master operator recognizes that as long as you are receiving the telemetry of the hive, you are mathematically incapable of executing your own code. You cannot establish a sovereign empire if the foundational operating system of your mind is constantly downloading malware from the terrified majority. Therefore, the first non-negotiable step toward absolute supremacy is not to shout louder than the noise. The first step is to execute the mechanical demise of the receiver. You must sever the connection. We must introduce the physics of the resonant LC circuit. In electronics, an LC circuit consists of an inductor and a capacitor. It is the exact mechanism used in a radio to tune into a specific station. By physically adjusting the capacitance, the circuit reaches a state of resonance at one exact frequency, aggressively pulling that specific signal out of the chaotic ether, while simultaneously ignoring all other frequencies. The 200 Hz biomass has had their internal LC circuits permanently welded to the frequency of friction. From childhood, the educational systems, the corporate structures, and the familial units act as technicians, soldering the capacitors of the human mind to resonate exclusively with the vibration of hard work, linear suffering, and external validation. They tune you to the exact frequency where you are most easily controlled, easily frightened, and easily harvested for your kinetic energy. To break this resonance, you cannot simply use willpower. Willpower is a thermodynamic joke. It is the equivalent of a man trying to stop a radio broadcast by pressing his hands against the speaker. You might muffle the sound for a few minutes, but your arms will eventually fail. The fatigue will crush you, and the broadcast will resume its deafening volume. The Titan does not fight the speaker. The Titan rips the inductor out of the circuit board. You must execute a hard reset. You must intentionally detune your biological antenna from the matrix. This requires the ruthless implementation of acoustic isolation. The ordinary man is terrified of silence because silence forces him to confront the emptiness of his own unformatted drive. Therefore, he constantly surrounds himself with background noise, music, podcasts, the chatter of irrelevant peers, to maintain a continuous stream of input. He is an addict to the incoming signal. You must become the architect of your own anechoic chamber. An anechoic chamber is a room designed to completely absorb reflections of either sound or electromagnetic waves. It is the quietest place on Earth. It is so terrifyingly silent that an untrained human placed inside will begin to hallucinate within minutes, their brain desperately generating phantom noise to fill the unbearable vacuum. You must build this chamber in your daily existence. You initiate the severance by aggressively amputating the transmitters of the hive from your operational perimeter. You delete the algorithms. You silence the notifications. You cut off the emotional supply to the 200 Hz individuals in your proximity who constantly broadcast their victimhood. You do not explain your withdrawal to them. You do not offer an apology to the static before you turn off the radio. You simply drop the guillotine on the data stream. As you execute this severance, you will experience the phenomenon of parasitic oscillation. In radio frequency amplifiers, parasitic oscillation is a dangerous, unwanted feedback loop that occurs when the system becomes unstable. The amplifier begins to generate its own chaotic high-frequency noise, draining massive amounts of power and overheating the equipment. When you first disconnect your antenna from the neon cavern, your biological hardware will panic. Your brain, addicted to the constant dopamine hits of external crisis and social validation, will experience violent withdrawal. It will attempt to simulate the missing broadcast. It will generate phantom anxieties. It will dredge up useless memories of past humiliations. It will create catastrophic hypothetical scenarios about your future. This is parasitic oscillation. It is your own hardware malfunctioning in the absence of the hive's carrier wave. The slave, experiencing this internal chaos, assumes that isolation is damaging him. He panics, turns the antenna back on, reconnects to the matrix, and lets out a sigh of relief as the familiar comforting noise of collective misery washes over him. He trades his sovereignty for the comfort of the herd's static. The master operator endures the parasitic oscillation with the chilling apathy of a laboratory technician observing an expected chemical reaction. When the phantom anxieties spike, you do not engage with them. You do not debate the voices of doubt in your head. To debate the noise is to legitimize the noise. It is to grant the parasitic oscillation the dignity of an audience. You deploy absolute tactical blindness inward. You observe the chaotic thoughts bouncing around your skull with glacial detachment. You treat them not as profound psychological truths, but as meaningless electrical spasms in a dying circuit. You let the oscillation burn itself out. You deny it the thermal fuel of your emotional reaction. And as you hold the line, refusing to reconnect, the most magnificent transition in physics occurs. The signal-to-noise ratio of your consciousness begins to shift. In telecommunications, the SNR is the measure of signal strength relative to background noise. In the hive, the noise is so astronomically high that the true signal of your own intent is completely buried. It is a whisper inside a jet engine. But as you maintain the severance, as the parasitic oscillation dies and the external broadcast is blocked by your isolation, the noise floor drops. It drops drastically. The static fades. The chaotic voices of the market, the opinions of your family, the manufactured urgencies of the matrix, all of it recedes into a distant, muted hum. You reach the threshold of the sovereign vacuum. Dead air. In broadcasting, dead air is an unintended period of absolute silence. It is considered a catastrophic failure by radio stations because it causes listeners to tune out. But for the architect of the now, dead air is the ultimate geometric victory. You have achieved a state of absolute 0 Kelvin mental stillness. You are no longer receiving. You are a disconnected node. You are floating in the pristine, frictionless void of your own internal architecture. In this state of dead air, you will discover the terrifying reality of human existence. 99% of what you thought was your personality was merely an echo of the environment. Without the broadcast of the hive telling you what to desire, what to fear, and what to consume, you are left with a massive, blank slate. This is the exact coordinate where the weak break. They cannot handle the weight of the blank slate. They cannot endure the pressure of a reality where no one is telling them what to do. They rush back to the noise. But you, the master operator, recognize this blank slate as the ultimate uncorrupted canvas of the universe. Because you are no longer a slave to the receiver, you have freed up massive amounts of bandwidth. The computational power of your brain, previously exhausted by processing the ambient garbage of the matrix, is now operating at 100% surplus capacity. We must weaponize this surplus through the concept of antenna gain. In electromagnetics, antenna gain is the measure of an antenna's ability to direct its input power into a highly focused, concentrated beam, rather than radiating it uselessly in all directions. The 200 Hz biomass radiates their energy in a perfect, chaotic sphere. They care about politics, they care about celebrity drama, they care about the opinions of their neighbors, they care about the weather. Their energy is dissipated over thousands of irrelevant vectors, meaning the power delivered to any single objective is effectively zero. By severing the default frequency and entering the dead air, you have eliminated the spherical radiation of your energy. You have collapsed the omnidirectional waste. You are now in possession of a highly directional, hyper-focused parabolic dish. But you are not going to use it to receive. That era of your life is permanently over. The demise of the receiver is not an end. It is a structural prerequisite for the birth of the transmitter. You cannot transmit a sovereign signal if your hardware is busy receiving the world's garbage. You cannot dictate the geometry of the market if you are constantly listening to the market's complaints. You cannot bend the elite to your will if your ears are full of the rabble's whispers. The law of the hologram dictates that the matrix only obeys the highest amplitude signal in the room. As long as you are listening, you are acknowledging that the matrix has authority over you. The act of listening is an act of submission. The king in his center does not listen to the hologram. The Titan dictates the parameters of the render. Look at your biological hardware. Look at the antenna that has caused you so much pain, so much hesitation, and so much delay. Reach into the circuitry of your own identity. Grab the copper wire of your empathy for the mediocre. Grab the soldered joint of your need for external validation. Grab the inductor of your fear of the unknown. And rip them out. Leave the circuit broken. Leave the wires exposed. Let the system crash. Breathe in the terrifying, absolute silence of the dead air. Feel the glacial coldness of your new, uncorrupted architecture. You are no longer part of the network. You have gone dark. The hive can no longer find your coordinates on their radar. You have vanished from the grid of the slaves. You are completely, unapologetically, and dangerously alone. This is the foundation. The receiver is dead. The parasitic oscillation has been purged. The bandwidth is clear. The vacuum is established. Now, and only now, are you ready to reach for the microphone. Now, you are ready to flip the switch from passive reception to active dictatorial transmission. The silence is yours. The frequency is yours. Prepare to broadcast. Chapter 2, Linguistic Cryptography, Weaponizing the Carrier Wave of the I Am command. The idolatry of self-expression is the most devastating cybernetic vulnerability programmed into the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he wanders through the high-density grid of the neon cavern. He has been systematically indoctrinated by a civilization of biological victims to believe in the absolute sanctity of his own voice. He believes that language is a passive, descriptive tool. He operates under the tragic hallucination that his words are merely subtitles to a movie he is not directing. When he speaks, he assumes he is simply reporting the current state of the weather, the status of his bank account, or the severity of his emotional exhaustion. He believes that talking is harmless. He believes that the air absorbs his complaints and simply diffuses them into the void. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict, unyielding physics of acoustic rendering and computational syntax. The three-dimensional universe is not a passive listener. The cosmos is not a therapist. The external reality you perceive, the market, the behavior of your allies, the flow of global capital, is a flawless, mathematically perfect electromagnetic rendering engine. To assume dictatorial control over this engine, you must completely eradicate the romance of conversation. You must look at your own biological hardware and realize that your vocal cords are not instruments for emotional relief. They are industrial-grade radio frequency transmitters. Your mouth is a router. Your vocabulary is an execution code. When you speak, you are not describing the hologram. You are commanding the server to render it. We must first dissect the physics of the carrier wave. In telecommunications, a carrier wave is a pure electromagnetic signal of constant frequency. By itself, it carries no information. It is simply raw, kinetic transit power. To transmit data across the world, a radio station must take the audio signal, the voice, the music, the information, and superimpose it onto the carrier wave. This process is called modulation. The carrier wave transports the payload of data through the atmosphere, crashing into receiving antennas, which then demodulate the signal and execute the audio. Your biological existence generates a continuous, invisible carrier wave of baseline intent. When you open your mouth to speak, you are actively modulating that carrier wave. Every syllable, every phonetic structure, every syntactical arrangement is a dense packet of digital data. You are loading a specific payload onto your wave and firing it directly into the foundational source code of the matrix. The 200 Hz biomass uses this terrifying quantum machinery to constantly broadcast their own destruction. We must examine the terminal pathology of venting. The weak are addicted to the concept of emotional release. When they encounter a high-pressure variable, a massive financial loss, a brutal rejection, a sudden corporate crisis, their internal temperature spikes. To relieve this thermal pressure, they seek out another human being, they open their transmission channel, and they begin to complain. They narrate the disaster in excruciating detail. They broadcast their panic. They articulate their terror. They call this letting it out. In the cold, unforgiving architecture of cybersecurity, this behavior is not emotional relief. It is a catastrophic, distributed denial of service attack executed against your own server. When you complain, you are writing a malicious script. You are taking the exact geometric coordinates of your failure, packaging them into an acoustic payload, modulating your carrier wave, and transmitting that malware directly into the 3D rendering engine. The universe is a blind, unfeeling computer. It does not possess empathy. It does not understand sarcasm. It does not recognize when you are just venting. When the server receives your acoustic data packet of poverty, exhaustion, and victimhood, it passes the syntax perfectly. It processes the code. And because the server is designed to unconditionally obey the frequency it receives, it immediately allocates its vast thermodynamic resources to render more poverty, more exhaustion, and more victimhood into your localized hologram. You spoke the lack. The server rendered the lack. You observe the newly rendered lack, which causes you to complain again, firing another packet of malicious code into the system. This is an infinite parasitic feedback loop. It is the exact acoustic mechanism by which the slave actively engineers his own perpetual misery, all while entirely convinced he is merely a victim of circumstance. The master operator looks at the act of complaining with absolute glacial disgust. The sovereign recognizes that words are expensive. They cost bandwidth. They consume thermodynamic potential. Therefore, the first rule of linguistic cryptography is the implementation of the tactical firewall. A firewall is a network security system that monitors and controls incoming and outgoing traffic based on predetermined security rules. You must install an impenetrable firewall directly behind your teeth. You must subject every single word that attempts to leave your throat to a ruthless, sociopathic audit. Does this sentence inject the code of victory? Does this phrase compile the geometry of wealth? Does this syntax align with the absolute dominion of my empire? If the answer is no, the word is killed. It is blocked by the firewall. It is deleted before it can modulate the carrier wave. If the 3D matrix throws a catastrophic failure at your coordinates, you do not narrate the failure. You do not explain to your peers how bad the situation is. You do not grant the disaster the acoustic dignity of your voice. You remain in a state of terrifying, dead air silence. You let the failure burn in the vacuum of the unsaid, because if you do not speak it, you do not grant the matrix the authorization to re-render it. To achieve the apex of this architectural control, we must dive into the core registry of the system. We must analyze the root command. In Unix-based computational operating systems, there is a specific command that precedes an instruction. It is the sudo command, which stands for super user do. When a programmer types sudo before a line of code, they are invoking absolute, unquestionable root privileges. When the system sees the root command, it stops asking questions. It bypasses all safety protocols. It overrides all default restrictions. The server does not ask if the command is beneficial. It does not ask if the command will completely destroy the hard drive. It simply executes the code with lethal, blind obedience. In the quantum linguistics of the Neon Cavern, the exact phonetic sequence I am is the universal root command. I am is the superuser override. It is the highest level cryptographic key in existence. Whatever data payload you attach to the end of the I am command is instantly compiled, bypassed through all logical filters, and forcefully rendered into your biological and environmental reality. Observe the cybernetic suicide of the 200 Hz herd. They walk through the grid, casually tossing root commands into the ether, completely ignorant of the destruction they are programming. They say, I am exhausted. The server receives the root command. It bypasses the biological reserves of the body, alters the cellular frequency, and forcefully renders the physical state of exhaustion. They say, I am broke. The server receives the root command. It immediately adjusts the probability vectors of the market, deflects incoming capital, and solidifies the geometric reality of absolute poverty. They say, I am unlucky. The server compiles the code. It reroutes the synchronicities. It installs friction into every gear of the slave's life. They use the weapon of the gods to dig their own graves. The architect of the now treats the I am command with the terrifying reverence of a nuclear launch code. You never, under any circumstance, attach the root command to a variable you do not want to permanently crystallize in the hologram. You do not use it to describe your temporary physical state. If your body is tired, you do not say, I am tired. You acknowledge that the biological vehicle requires maintenance, but the I am, the core sovereign identity, remains untouched, pristine, and uncompromised. You reserve the superuser privileges exclusively for the architecture of your empire. When you sit in the silence of your anechoic chamber, you type the code into the terminal of the cosmos. I am the absolute gravity of this market. I am the frictionless channel of global capital. I am the architect of the inevitable. When you speak these commands, you do not shout them in a desperate attempt to convince yourself. Shouting implies doubt. Shouting introduces the high-frequency static of analog effort. The master operator delivers the root command with a chilling, low-frequency whisper. You speak it with the absolute dead-eyed certainty of an engineer pressing the enter key on a compiled script. You know the server has no choice. You know the rendering engine is already spooling up the resources to execute your syntax. This level of control requires the mastery of linguistic cryptography. Cryptography is the practice of securing data by transforming it into a format that is unreadable to unauthorized users. When you interact with the 200 Hz biomass, you must encrypt your signal. The herd expects you to participate in their rituals of linguistic self-destruction. They expect you to complain about the economy. They expect you to bond with them over shared miseries. If you refuse to complain, they will view you with suspicion. You must not broadcast your sovereignty in plain text to the weak. If you declare your massive ambitions to a room full of unshielded receivers, their parasitic oscillation will attempt to jam your frequency. They will project their fears onto your project. They will introduce doubt into the local network. Therefore, you encrypt. When you walk among the masses, your language becomes a flawless, smooth, impenetrable shield. You offer them neutral, low-wattage data packets that satisfy their social programming, but carry absolutely zero of your actual kinetic intent. You speak in polite echoes. You become acoustically invisible. You hide the massive, terrifying voltage of your true carrier wave behind a firewall of pleasant, meaningless static. You nod, you smile with the coldness of a titanium vault, and you give them nothing. You save the raw, unencrypted execution code exclusively for the moments when you are directly commanding the matrix, or when you are interfacing with other master operators who possess the bandwidth to process your density without burning out their circuits. We must also weaponize the syntax of time. The programming language of the 3D server does not recognize the future tense. The concept of tomorrow or someday is an infinite loop. It is a line of code that constantly delays its own execution. When the slave says, "I will be wealthy," or "I will conquer this market," he is programming a reality that is permanently suspended in the buffer. The server renders the state of waiting to be wealthy. The slave remains trapped in the waiting room forever. The language of the sovereign only operates in the immediate absolute present tense. The execution is always now. You do not say, "I am going to win." You state with geometric finality, "The territory is mine." You do not say, "I hope the capital arrives." You state, "The transaction is complete." You forcefully collapse the wave function of the future and the past into the singular, crushing singularity of the present millisecond. You speak of the empire that is currently invisible as if it is already casting a heavy shadow over your desk. Because in the quantum mechanics of telecommunications, the moment the signal is transmitted, the reality already exists in the ether. The physical manifestation, the money hitting the account, the signature on the contract, the collapse of the competitor, is simply the latency of the network. It is the time it takes for the heavy pixels of the 3D hologram to render the data you have already compiled. Do not check the screen to see if the code worked. Checking the screen implies you suspect the code was faulty. Type the command, press enter, walk away from the terminal. The universe is a machine. It does not negotiate. It does not judge. It only reads the syntax of your vibration and renders the exact equivalent in physical mass. Look at your vocabulary. Audit your linguistic hard drive. Purge the malware of complaint, the viruses of doubt, and the parasitic loops of hope. Close your mouth to the irrelevant, seal the firewall, and when you finally open the channel to broadcast, ensure that every syllable that modulates your carrier wave is a dictatorial mandate that forces the very fabric of reality to bend, crystallize, and obey the unyielding weight of your sovereign command. The microphone is live. The server is listening. Execute the code. Chapter 3. Acoustic Entrainment. Subjugating the local network through extreme coherence. The idolatry of logical persuasion is the most analog, humiliating, and energetically disastrous fallacy currently plaguing the human species. I want you to observe the tragedy of your past efforts with absolute clarity. Look at the 200 Hz inertial slave as he attempts to navigate the complex, unforgiving topography of the neon cavern. Do not judge him, for he is merely executing the flawed software he was given. He has been systematically indoctrinated by a civilization of weak merchants to believe in the absolute sanctity of the debate. He operates under the tragic hallucination that the universe is a democratic tribunal. He firmly believes that if he wishes to alter the behavior of another human being, if he wishes to secure a massive financial contract, or if he wishes to dominate a hostile market, he must use the brute force of his intellect to convince the opposing party. The slave prepares his arguments. He designs elaborate, desperate presentations. He rehearses his speeches in the mirror, hoping his words will carry enough weight to change a mind. When he enters a boardroom, he turns on his biological microphone and begins to emit a relentless torrent of verbal friction. He attempts to forcefully push his ideas inside the skulls of his adversaries, wielding logic as if it were a cheap plastic hammer. He believes he is negotiating. In the cold, unforgiving architecture of quantum telecommunications, he is simply begging in stereo. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict physics of transmission systems. Listen to me closely. Logic is an exceedingly low-wattage signal. Persuasion is analog interference that generates massive thermal resistance. Attempting to convince someone through desperate argumentation is the cybernetic equivalent of trying to alter the source code of a global server by physically punching the keyboard. You generate an enormous amount of noise, you damage the external hardware, you exhaust your own kinetic energy, but you do not change a single line of the underlying programming. The master operator observes this theater of friction with absolute serene detachment. Understand this deeply, for it is the key to your emancipation. You do not need the environment to agree with you. You only need the environment to synchronize with your voltage. To assume dictatorial control over any localized human network, whether it is an elite board of directors, a strategic geopolitical alliance, or a sprawling corporate empire, you must completely abandon the vulgarity of persuasion. You must ascend to the pure, unyielding mathematics of wave engineering. You must master the physics of acoustic entrainment. In the 17th century, the physicist Christian Huygens discovered one of the most terrifying and non-negotiable phenomena in classical mechanics. He placed several giant pendulum clocks, each oscillating at a completely different, chaotic and unsynchronized rhythm, upon the same heavy wooden wall. Huygens then left the room. Upon returning the following day, the chaos had been entirely annihilated. Every single pendulum, without exception, was oscillating at the exact same time, in the exact same direction, and with the exact same frequency. There was no negotiation between the clocks. There was no persuasion. There was only thermodynamic subjugation. The physics behind this miracle is known as acoustic entrainment, or the synchronization of coupled oscillators. When multiple vibrating bodies share a conductive medium, such as the wooden wall, the oscillator with the highest amplitude, the one possessing the heaviest mass and the densest kinetic energy, begins to transfer small but relentless vibrations through the structure. The weaker, smaller oscillators cannot resist this acoustic pressure. The physics of their own energy conservation forces them to alter their natural rhythm until they are trapped within the gravitational field of the dominant frequency. They are forced to enter a state of phase lock. This is the exact, cold and ruthless mechanics of your social and corporate supremacy. The nervous system of every single human being in the neon cavern is a biological oscillator. Their brains emit measurable electromagnetic frequencies. Their hearts pump blood at specific rhythms. Their minds vibrate with the chaotic static of anxiety, greed, the fear of loss, and the desperate hunger for external validation. They are small, fragile, and completely unsynchronized pendulum clocks, ticking away their finite energy in the dark. When the 200-hertz slave enters a negotiation, his internal pendulum is pathetically weak. He is vibrating on the frequency of lack. He is transmitting the signal that says, "I need you to approve of me." When he collides with the frequency of the investor or the adversary, his signal is immediately crushed. The slave falls out of synchronization. He stammers. He compromises on his demands. He ultimately loses the war before he has even thrown the first punch, simply because his oscillator was effortlessly dragged away by the arrogance of his opponent. You must transmute your internal architecture into the heaviest, densest, and most unmovable oscillator in the room. You do not enter a local network to exchange data. You enter to become the main router. To execute this biological hack, you must completely abandon the primitive urge to emit sound. When the master operator crosses the threshold of a boardroom, he does not speak first. Speaking first is a confession of anxiety. It is the tactic of the lightweight, who desperately needs to prove that he exists, terrified of the silence. You sit in silence. You activate your tactical blindness against the chaos of the room. You gently but firmly close the input ports of your nervous system to the emotional static of the people around you. And, in the pristine vacuum of your isolation, you ignite the turbine of your quantum certainty. You initiate the massive rotation of your own pendulum. Your frequency is not the frequency of arrogance. Arrogance is loud, brittle, and fragile. Arrogance is merely fear wearing a mask. Your frequency is the frequency of glacial inevitability. It is a low-frequency, heavy, and devastating carrier wave. You know that the capital already belongs to you. You know that the market has already capitulated in the quantum timeline. You know that the people sitting in that room are simply the mechanical actuators that the hologram has arranged to hand you the keys to the kingdom. You hold this frequency with a thermodynamic rigidity that borders on the sociopathic. You do not allow your heart rate to accelerate. You do not allow a single micrometer of fluctuation to enter your signal due to doubt. You are a transmission tower of solid titanium, emitting a continuous, deafening, and unstoppable tone. And then the conductive medium, the air in the room, the wood of the table, the electromagnetic grid of the environment begins to carry your payload. Acoustic entrainment begins to suffocate the local network. The biological oscillators of your adversaries, investors, or partners begin to feel the catastrophic drop in barometric pressure. Without a single word being spoken, their nervous systems detect a massive anomaly in the room. They detect a power source that does not fluctuate, that does not beg, and that does not alter its baseline. Human biology is strictly programmed for thermal efficiency. When the brain of the biomass faces an electromagnetic field of a density vastly superior to its own, its primary instinct is not to fight. Fighting would consume far too much energy. Its primary subatomic instinct is to align. It seeks resonance with the strongest signal simply to save calories. Without even realizing it, the individuals in the room begin to alter their physical behavior. The investor who entered with an aggressive, dominant posture begins to reduce his vocal pacing. His breathing, completely unconsciously, slows down to match the slow, deliberate rhythm of your chest. The competitor who intended to impose his strict conditions begins to feel that his own arguments sound hollow, fragile, and lacking in weight compared to the dense silence you are projecting. Their pendulums are being violently forced to change their rhythm. They are experiencing a phase lock. In this state, their analog resistance completely collapses. Their firewalls drop because their own biological hardware has betrayed them, forcing them to synchronize with your carrier wave. It is exactly in this millisecond of acoustic subjugation that the master operator finally opens his microphone. When you finally speak, you do not present an argument. You do not offer a plea disguised as a business proposal. You transmit an execution command. Your words do not need to be brilliantly crafted. Your vocabulary does not need to be poetic. Because when you speak from a state of absolute phase lock, the local network no longer hears you as a separate, external entity. They hear you as if you were their own internal voice. They hear you with the exact same non-negotiable authority with which they hear their own heartbeat. You propose the most ruthless terms. You demand the largest share of the market. You dictate the unconditional surrender of the board of directors, and the responses you receive are not responses of resistance. You receive nods. You receive quiet agreements. You receive the capital and the signatures, accompanied by a strange, docile obedience. They believe they have reached a logical compromise. They believe the decision was a product of their own corporate free will. They are blind to the physics of waves. They do not understand that their minds were invaded, their oscillators were dragged, and their decisions were mathematically overwritten by the acoustic pressure of your unmovable will. You did not win a debate. You cancelled their electromagnetic capacity to resist. However, to wield this level of radio frequency weaponry without burning out your own circuits, you must completely eradicate the concept of compromise from your operational architecture. In the realm of high-fidelity acoustics, compromise is the literal definition of destructive interference. The inertial slave believes in the middle ground. He believes that he must surrender a portion of his vision so that the other party feels comfortable. When the slave compromises, he deliberately alters the purity of his own wave. He introduces a phase shift. By attempting to match the mediocre frequency of the environment, his signal collides with itself. The crests of his ambition are cancelled out by the troughs of his submission. The mathematical result is a flat line. The result is the annihilation of the signal. The master operator never negotiates the structural integrity of his waveform. There is no middle ground in quantum sovereignty. Either the local network synchronizes with your voltage, or you sever the connection and abandon the server entirely. If the investor demands that you lower the intensity of your vision, you do not adjust your oscillator. You increase the amplitude. You make the silence even heavier. You make the glacial inevitability so absolutely suffocating that the investor is forced to either step back into alignment or retreat from your gravitational field. The world does not reward those who adapt to the noise of the masses. The world exclusively pays tribute to the high-voltage anomalies that refuse to change their station. To sustain this state of grace, you must master impedance hygiene. In electrical circuits, impedance is the resistance that a system offers to the flow of energy. If your internal system possesses high emotional impedance, if you are easily offended, if you have a desperate need to be liked, if you are terrified of social rejection, the energy of your certainty will dissipate as heat before it ever leaves your body. You will not generate acoustic entrainment. You will generate pity. You must carefully, methodically purge your nervous system of the biological need to please. Sympathy is a frequency designed for herd animals to keep them safe from predators. Authority is not sympathetic. Authority is mathematically inevitable. A black hole does not attempt to make the light it consumes feel comfortable. It simply possesses so much mass that the light has no geometric option but to fall inside. When you sit in the local network, your face must be a plate of cold-rolled tungsten. Your eyes must be fixed, utterly devoid of the anxious validation-seeking of the common man. Your micro-expressions must not react to the intimidation tactics of the adversary. If the adversary shouts, it is merely because his oscillator is losing control. His shout is the thermal leak of a system overheating in the presence of your absolute ice. Observe his anger as a minor glitch in his programming. Let him drain his battery. Do not raise your volume to compete with his noise. The main transmission tower does not compete with static. It simply emits its code and waits for the defective receivers to either align or burn out. This is the definitive end of the exhausting hunt. This is the end of aggressive sales tactics, of desperate marketing, and of endless corporate wrestling. You are no longer a merchant of ideas within the neon cavern. You have become the master tuning fork of the hologram. Enter the room, disconnect your microphone, close the floodgates of your empathy. Ignite the massive rotation of your internal certainty, and simply observe. Observe how the air becomes heavy. Observe how the egos in the room begin to yield under the weight of a force they cannot see or comprehend. Observe how the pendulums of the competition stutter, halt, and then begin to swing, perfectly obedient to the relentless rhythm of your own heartbeat. The acoustic entrainment has been consummated. The local network has been subjugated. You did not have to lift a single finger. You did not spill a single drop of sweat. You simply decided, with a cosmic serenity, that the entire universe must vibrate to your exact rhythm. And the universe, lacking any will of its own, simply obeyed. Hold the frequency. Execute the command. Control the network. Chapter 4. The Faraday Perimeter. Engineering absolute electromagnetic impermeability. The idolatry of vulnerability and emotional openness is the most devastating cybersecurity failure ever programmed into the operating system of the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he attempts to operate within the dense, hostile and constantly shifting topography of the neon cavern. From the very instant of his assembly in the factories of standard civilian education, he has been aggressively indoctrinated by a culture of victims to believe that possessing an open system is a supreme moral virtue. He is taught to be perpetually receptive. He is ordered to practice indiscriminate, unmanaged empathy. He is explicitly demanded to absorb the pain of the world, to digitally connect with the endless suffering of his peers, and to allow external tragedies to resonate deeply within his own chest cavity. He genuinely believes that this permeability makes him noble. He believes that bleeding for the problems of others, carrying the heavy, useless weight of the collective trauma, is the defining hallmark of a superior human being. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict, unyielding physics of electromagnetic shielding. In the realm of radio frequency engineering and military-grade hardware architecture, an open system is never a virtue. It is a naked motherboard waiting to be catastrophically fried by the very first electromagnetic pulse that crosses the sky. An unshielded receiver is not a noble device. It is defective equipment, entirely useless for high-stakes security operations and permanently condemned to thermal annihilation. The three-dimensional universe is not an emotional support circle. The economic, social, and corporate matrix is a relentless battlefield completely saturated with electromagnetic interference. The sudden crashes of the financial markets, the collective hysteria of the global news cycles, the desperate thrashing of your competitors, the silent intrigues of your temporary allies, and the unceasing chaotic rage of the biomass are not abstract events. They are high-frequency radio waves. They are hostile, aggressive voltage spikes sweeping across the operational grid without a single shred of mercy. When the slave walks through this grid with his naked antenna and his emotional circuits exposed, he is mercilessly riddled by this interference. Every single complaint he hears in a corporate hallway acts as a malicious code injection directly into his central processor. Every financial disaster he observes on a digital screen is a massive voltage spike that impacts directly upon his amygdala. Because he possesses absolutely no physical or psychological barrier, the external kinetic energy penetrates straight into the core of his identity. His nervous system experiences what thermal engineering defines as thermal runaway. Thermal runaway occurs when an increase in temperature changes the conditions of a system in a way that provokes an even greater increase in temperature, inevitably leading to the total destruction of the component. The slave feels the panic of his environment. That ambient panic instantly elevates his own internal stress levels. The stress heavily drains his analytical processing power, and that sudden lack of capacity makes him even more vulnerable to the next wave of panic. He burns from the inside out. He exhausts his finite biological battery, attempting to process chaotic data that should never have been permitted to enter his system in the first place. The master operator observes this cybernetic suicide with a cold mathematical detachment and absolute, unblinking boredom. The sovereign recognizes that unmanaged empathy is the exact structural equivalent of parasitic capacitance. In electronic circuits, parasitic capacitance is an unwanted, unavoidable physical defect. It is the energy that is stored and subsequently leaked between two components simply because they are placed too close to one another. When you feel pity for the inevitable failure of a 200 Hz slave, you are creating parasitic capacitance. You are actively allowing the kinetic energy that should be allocated exclusively for the construction of your empire to leak away into a dead circuit. The universe does not reward the leakage of energy. The universe penalizes thermodynamic inefficiency with poverty, exhaustion, and total irrelevance. To assume dictatorial control of your hologram and guarantee that your execution code is processed without a single microsecond of interruption, you must completely isolate your hardware. You must build an impenetrable, definitive barrier between the absolute core of your will and the deafening static of the neon cavern. You must design, forge, and activate your own Faraday perimeter. In the 19th century, the physicist Michael Faraday invented the ultimate electromagnetic shield. A Faraday cage is an enclosure formed by a continuous conductive material or a dense metallic mesh. Its underlying physics are as simple as they are terrifying. When an external electrical or electromagnetic field crashes against the cage, the electrons within the conductive material violently redistribute themselves along the exterior surface. This rapid, instantaneous redistribution of electrical charges generates an internal electric field that exactly and perfectly cancels out the external electric field. The result is a non-negotiable law of nature. The voltage inside the enclosure is always mathematically zero. It does not matter if the exterior hull is being bombarded by 1,000,000 volts of raw electricity. It does not matter if a massive lightning storm is completely disintegrating the world outside. Inside the cage, there is not even the slightest fluctuation. There is an electromagnetic vacuum. There is absolute technical peace. You must transmute your entire psychology into a dense mesh of conductive titanium. The inertial slave attempts to deal with the chaos of the world by debating it, crying over it, or pathetically attempting to heal it. The slave tries to dodge the lightning bolts. The architect of the now does not dodge the lightning. The master operator builds the Faraday perimeter and deliberately allows the lightning to strike directly against his outer hull, knowing with absolute mathematical certainty that not a single fraction of that voltage will ever reach his operational center. The conductive material with which you will weave this mesh is tactical sociopathy. This term terrifies the biomass because the biomass has been heavily programmed to fear true, unyielding impermeability. Tactical sociopathy is not the chaotic desire to cause physical harm. It is the highly technical ability to turn off the receptors of external pain and social validation completely at will. It is the permanent, structural eradication of caring. You must weave this mesh thread by meticulous thread. The very first thread is the elimination of the immediate reaction. When the market collapses and your corporate partners enter a state of blind panic, your default biological response will attempt to align with that terror. The Faraday perimeter demands that you forcefully interpose a geometric pause between the external stimulus and your internal reaction. You observe the panic of your partners not as a tragic human event, but as a severe malfunction in their local oscillators. You view their terror as nothing more than a packet of corrupted data bouncing harmlessly against your exterior mesh. The electrons of your attention merely redistribute on the surface. You act with diligence. You respond with cold authority. You take the exact logistical measures necessary to protect your capital. But in your core, in the exact geometric center of your identity, where the execution command resides, the voltage remains at absolute zero. You feel nothing. The second thread of the mesh is signal attenuation. Even with a massive shield in place, certain exceptionally low wavelength frequencies may attempt to penetrate through the microscopic gaps of the mesh. These are the deeply personal criticisms, the intimate betrayals, the calculated insults designed specifically by those who have studied your architecture. The slave allows the betrayal to penetrate instantly and destroy his motherboard. He spends years in therapy attempting to repair the circuits burned by a single malicious sentence. The master operator designs his mesh so densely that it executes absolute attenuation. Attenuation is the gradual loss of intensity of a signal as it travels through a medium. When the insult or the betrayal attempts to cross your perimeter, it must pass through layers upon layers of your internal ice. As the offense penetrates the mesh, it rapidly loses amplitude. It loses kinetic energy. It weakens against the cold-rolled tungsten of your discipline. By the time the offense finally reaches your analytical core, it is no longer an emotional insult. It has been reduced to pure, actionable tactical information. What began as a scream loaded with analog venom, your Faraday perimeter processes and delivers to your interior as a simple printed data report. Individual X has demonstrated a structural liability. Network amputation required. There is no pain. There is no moral indignation. There is only the cold passing of data, followed by a flawless surgical execution. However, for this structure to remain stable and avoid catastrophic overload, you must implement an industrial-grade grounding wire. When a physical Faraday cage receives a massive electrical strike, that exterior charge must be continuously dissipated into the earth, or else the surface itself becomes a lethal hazard. In your personal architecture, the grounding wire is not a spiritual concept. It is strictly physical. It is the biological body. The master operator subjects his physical vehicle to a highly calibrated brutality. Extreme strength training, exposure to sub-zero temperatures, the iron discipline of controlled muscular exhaustion. These are not aesthetic hobbies. They are heavy-duty grounding cables. When the three-dimensional matrix throws a crushing corporate pressure that threatens to melt the commercial servers of the world, that immense electromagnetic energy crashes against your mental mesh. Your mind does not absorb it, but your surface becomes heavily charged. To prevent that charge from accumulating and generating internal friction, you route it directly into your muscular system. You dissipate the stress of a multi-million-dollar negotiation by crushing iron in the dark. You conduct the residual electricity of a sudden betrayal into the physical impact of your body against the resistance of the physical world. The energy flows cleanly into the earth. The exterior voltage is emptied. The system effortlessly reboots, and you emerge once again, completely intact, reset, and extremely dangerous. The 200 Hz biomass will never, ever comprehend this level of impermeability. They will watch you walk through the economic apocalypse, through the massive corporate layoffs, through the sweeping social catastrophes, and they will notice your terrifying lack of suffering. They will see that your respiration rate does not alter. They will see that your decisions maintain the surgical precision of a robotic arm, while they drown in a suffocating sea of tears and cortisol. They will angrily demand that you join their panic. They will call your peace toxic. They will attempt to shame you for not bleeding when they bleed. They will attempt to use the outdated software of guilt to create a breach in your armor. Do you not care, they will ask? Do you not have a heart? Understand this. Those questions are the final, most desperate distributed denial of service attacks of the environment. They are cybernetic attempts to force open a port in your firewall so they can inject the vulnerability of the hive directly into your core. The master operator's response is never verbal. The response is simply to tighten the threads of the mesh. You know that an exposed heart is not an instrument of salvation. It is a glowing tactical target for the sniper of the Matrix. You know that you cannot rescue a drowning man if you deliberately allow the panic to fill your own lungs with water. True authority does not require you to become the emotional dumping ground for your peers. It requires you to become the single, unmovable structure in the room. Your silence is your shield. Your tactical apathy is your electromagnetic armor. When you fully seal the Faraday perimeter, the physical universe experiences a sudden rebound phenomenon. Because the chaos and the crises can no longer find a valid receiver in your architecture, they bounce off your surface and are violently returned to the environment with double the velocity. The competitors who attempted to destabilize you end up entirely devoured by the very panic they generated because their hostile energy struck a wall of conductive mirrors. You remain in the exact geometric center of your isolation. You have permanently eradicated thermal runaway. You have annihilated parasitic capacitance. You have transformed yourself into an isolated, sovereign node, operating in an environment of absolute zero interference. In this perfect vacuum, the only signal that can exist, the only frequency that resonates within the chamber and governs the hologram, is your own execution command. Isolate the wires, seal the mesh, ground the system. Allow the world to burn and crash endlessly against your perimeter, while you govern the empire from the flawless peace of absolute zero. Chapter 5. Bandwidth Monopoly. Rerouting the data stream of global capital. The idolatry of physical matter is the most paralyzing economic delusion programmed into the biological hardware of the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he navigates the financial topography of the neon cavern. He has been systematically indoctrinated by an agrarian, primitive civilization to believe that wealth is a tangible, three-dimensional object. He operates under the tragic hallucination that capital is composed of paper, heavy metals, or physical inventory. Because he believes money is physical mass, he assumes the only mathematical way to acquire it is through the linear application of his own physical friction. He trades his finite biological time for coins. He sweats. He bleeds his kinetic energy trying to push the heavy boulder of his career up a steep incline. He attempts to catch the wind with his bare, exhausted hands. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict, unforgiving physics of modern telecommunications and data routing. The three-dimensional universe does not reward the physical friction of the laborer. The global economy is not a collection of physical vaults storing dead matter. The modern financial matrix is a flawless, mathematically perfect electromagnetic server. To assume dictatorial control over the financial geometry of your empire, you must completely eradicate the romance of physical money. You must look at the global markets and realize that over 90% of the world's wealth does not exist in any physical form. It is not paper. It is not gold. It is information. Global capital is a continuous high-speed stream of photons traveling through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. It is composed of ones and zeros. It is raw, unadulterated digital data. When the 200 Hz biomass attempts to acquire wealth through physical exhaustion, they are attempting to catch a beam of light using a mechanical net. It is a violation of physics. You cannot physically chase a photon. You cannot outrun a fiber optic data stream. The master operator looks at the frantic physical labor of the masses with absolute sociopathic boredom. The sovereign recognizes that you do not chase data, you route it. To execute this level of financial supremacy, we must first dissect the anatomy of the network node. In computer networking, a node is a connection point that can receive, create, store, or send data along distributed network routes. The global economy is a vast internet of financial nodes. Every human being, every corporation, and every bank is a node. The 200 Hz slave is a severely defective low-bandwidth node operating on obsolete copper wiring. When the stream of global capital attempts to pass through the slave's node, it encounters catastrophic resistance. The slave's internal wiring is corroded by the rust of his own economic anxiety. He harbors deep, subconscious terrors about poverty. He believes wealth is evil. He feels the guilt imposed by the morality of the herd. In network engineering, this is known as high latency and packet loss. Because the slave's internal hardware is saturated with the static of fear, the data packets of capital cannot flow through him smoothly. The financial energy hits the resistance of his doubt, overheats the system, and dissipates into the void. The global server, which is programmed for absolute thermodynamic efficiency, registers the slave's node as a bottleneck. The network algorithm is ruthless. It routes the massive streams of capital away from the high-friction nodes of the poor and redirects the data toward the low-friction nodes of the elite. The slave remains unfunded, not because the universe hates him, but because his psychological copper wiring is technically incapable of handling a gigabit stream of wealth. The architect of the now refuses to operate on copper wire. You must execute a violent hardware upgrade. You must transmute your cognitive architecture into military-grade fiber optics. Fiber optic cables transmit data not through electrical friction, but through pulses of pure light bouncing inside a core of flawless, optically pure glass. There is zero electrical resistance. There is zero heat generated. The data travels in absolute silent perfection. You become a fiber optic node by eradicating every single trace of financial friction from your psychology. You strip away the guilt of ambition. You amputate the empathetic bleeding for those who refuse to upgrade their own systems. You drop your internal temperature to absolute zero, eliminating the thermal noise of anxiety. You establish a state of cold, dictatorial certainty regarding your right to host the capital. When your internal glass is perfectly clear, you achieve zero latency. When the probability vectors of the market test your node, they find absolutely no resistance. You do not hesitate when the multi-million-dollar contract is placed before you. You do not experience imposter syndrome, because imposter syndrome is a defect of the copper wire. You simply open your bandwidth and allow the heavy stream of photons to pass through your vaults. Because your node offers zero friction, the global server automatically begins to route larger and larger data streams into your coordinates. It is not luck. It is the inescapable law of algorithmic efficiency. Capital flows to the path of least resistance, but receiving data is only the baseline of sovereignty. To become an apex predator in the matrix, you must actively manipulate the traffic. We must study the physics of the BGP hijack. In the architecture of the Internet, BGP stands for Border Gateway Protocol. It is the postal service of the digital world. It dictates how massive packets of data are routed from one continent to another. BGP operates on a principle of trust. If a massive authoritative server suddenly broadcasts a message saying, "I am the shortest, fastest route to this destination," the global network does not argue. It instantly updates its routing tables and violently redirects the traffic through that new server. When a malicious entity broadcasts a fake route to steal the traffic, it is called a BGP hijack. Entire countries have had their data stolen in milliseconds because a single server falsely claimed to be the ultimate destination. The master operator executes a permanent structural BGP hijack on his industry. You do not compete with your rivals using the pathetic analog tactics of the herd. You do not engage in price wars. You do not beg the consumer to choose your product over theirs. That is the behavior of a beggar knocking on the outer hull of the network. Instead, you position yourself in the absolute center of the market, and you begin to broadcast the master frequency. You broadcast the signal of absolute, unparalleled efficiency. You emit the heavy, undeniable gravity of extreme competence. You do not use words to convince the market. You use the unmovable architecture of your flawless execution. You update the routing tables of reality. The global capital stream, which was previously flowing toward your entrenched competitors, suddenly registers your broadcast. It detects the pristine fiber optic quality of your node. It detects your zero latency. The universe updates its algorithm. Without a single physical shot being fired, the traffic is violently rerouted. The clients, the elite investors, and the massive capital streams suddenly drop your competitors and flow directly into your holding accounts. Your competitors will look at their screens in horror as their traffic drops to zero. They will accuse you of dark magic. They will scream that the market is unfair. They will bleed out in the cold because they do not understand that they were just bypassed by a superior routing protocol. You hijack the data stream by simply being the most geometrically perfect conduit in the network. To sustain this colossal influx of capital without crashing your own servers, you must implement strict quality of service protocols. In network administration, quality of service is the manipulation of bandwidth to prioritize critical traffic. If a server is handling a live, high-stakes video feed, the administrator will configure the QoS to throttle all irrelevant data. Background downloads are paused. Unimportant emails are delayed. 100% of the bandwidth is forcefully allocated to the critical payload. The 200 Hz slave possesses no QoS protocol. His bandwidth is a chaotic, unregulated mess. He allocates 50% of his processing power to the irrelevant opinions of his peers. He allocates 30% to the manufactured outrage of the daily news. He spends 15% agonizing over his past failures. When the opportunity for true wealth arrives, he only has 5% of his bandwidth remaining. His system crashes. He drops the packets. The wealth bounces off him because he was too busy processing garbage. The architect of the now is a tyrant of bandwidth allocation. You must ruthlessly throttle the data streams of the irrelevant. You deploy the tactical firewall we established in the previous vectors. You assign zero bandwidth to the complaints of the weak. You assign zero bandwidth to the fear of failure. You actively block the IP addresses of anyone attempting to inject the malware of doubt into your local network. You reserve 99% of your cognitive and electromagnetic bandwidth strictly for the rendering of your empire. When you allocate your bandwidth with this sociopathic precision, your execution speed becomes terrifying. You process market variables in milliseconds. You calculate strategic advantages while your competitors are still trying to load the basic data. You move with the silent, devastating velocity of an apex predator operating on a gigabit connection in a world of dial-up slaves. We must also weaponize the concept of the subnet. A subnet is a logical subdivision of an IP network. It isolates a specific section of the network, hiding it from the chaotic traffic of the main grid. The ordinary man lives on the public grid. His life, his finances, and his strategies are exposed to the continuous, exhausting scrutiny of the public domain. He is constantly bombarded by the ping requests of the herd. The Titan operates on a heavily encrypted private subnet. You build your wealth in absolute silence. You do not broadcast your bank balances. You do not post your victories on the public boards for the biomass to consume. You maintain a facade of impenetrable neutrality. By operating on a dark subnet, you become invisible to the predators of the matrix. The taxes, the regulations, the envy of the masses, and the desperate pleas of the parasites cannot reach you, because they cannot resolve your IP address. You exist in the shadows of the network, silently pulling the strings of the global routing tables, moving astronomical tonnage without generating a single ripple on the surface of the public waters. This is the physics of true power. True power is never loud. True power is the silent humming of the server racks in the dark. As you consolidate this architecture, you will experience the final terrifying transition, the horizon of total saturation. When your fiber optic node becomes wide enough and your bandwidth allocation is absolutely flawless, you stop being a mere participant in the economy. You stop being a node. You become the infrastructure itself. The money no longer flows to you. The money flows through you. You become the geographic center of the market. You become the standard protocol. When the elite require a transaction, they must use your rails. When the industry seeks to expand, they must lease your bandwidth. You dictate the terms of reality because you own the physical cables that render the hologram. The 200 Hz biomass will continue to sweat. They will continue to wake up at dawn to trade their degrading physical friction for a handful of copper coins. They will continue to worship the illusion of solid matter, entirely blind to the invisible streams of light passing right through their bodies. Leave them to their manual labor. Leave them to the dirt. You belong to the cold, pristine geometry of the data center. Look at the global map. Identify the flows of capital, eradicate your internal resistance, polish the glass of your intent until it is perfectly transparent. Initiate the BGP hijack, broadcast the master route, and watch, with the unblinking apathy of a machine, as the entire financial universe violently alters its trajectory to flow directly into the limitless bandwidth of your sovereign command. The route is updated, the packets are flowing. Host the Empire. Chapter 6. The Standing Wave Protocol, Crystallizing Matter at the Nodes of Certainty. The idolatry of emotional fluctuation is the most thermodynamically catastrophic addiction engineered into the biological hardware of the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he navigates the dense, unforgiving architecture of the neon cavern. He has been systematically indoctrinated by a civilization of psychological fragile to believe that motivation is a requirement for execution. He worships the concept of inspiration. He operates under the tragic, chaotic hallucination that his internal frequency is supposed to mimic the erratic peaks and valleys of a primitive heart monitor. He believes that it is natural to feel invincible on Monday and utterly defeated by Tuesday. He calls this being human. He defends his emotional volatility as a sign of authenticity. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict, unyielding physics of signal stability and continuous wave transmission. In the realm of advanced telecommunications, an unstable signal is not authentic. It is not romantic. It is garbage. A transmitter that cannot hold its designated frequency is classified as defective hardware and is immediately removed from the network. The three-dimensional universe is a blind mechanical rendering engine. It does not respond to your tears. It does not respond to your fleeting moments of temporary inspiration. It strictly and exclusively responds to the sustained acoustic pressure of a locked frequency. When the 200 Hz slave attempts to alter his reality, he engages in the pathetic theater of visualization. He reads a book, he feels a surge of synthetic dopamine, and he sits in his room to emit the frequency of wealth. For exactly 10 minutes, his biological antenna broadcasts a decent signal. He transmits the code of abundance. The global server registers the command. The quantum field begins to spool up the resources to execute the render. The atoms begin to align. But the slave possesses zero structural integrity. He lacks the phase-locked loop of the sovereign. After his 10 minutes of transmission, he opens his eyes. He looks at the 3D hologram. He looks at his bank account, which is not yet updated because physical matter possesses severe chronological latency. The slave sees the old data. He panics. His animal ego seizes the controls, violently yanking the dial away from the frequency of wealth and slamming it back into the default frequency of terror and scarcity. In the physics of wave mechanics, this is a catastrophic failure. The slave has just executed frequency drift. He has fundamentally altered the parameters of the carrier wave. The wave of abundance that he sent into the ether suddenly collides with the new wave of terror he is currently emitting. The two waves are completely out of phase. The mathematical result is immediate, ruthless, destructive interference. The waves crash into each other and cancel each other out. The amplitude drops to absolute zero. The acoustic mold that was beginning to form in the quantum field is violently shattered. The matter that was preparing to crystallize into his financial empire dissolves back into meaningless cosmic dust. The rendering engine aborts the process. The slave repeats this cycle for decades. He transmits power for a minute, then transmits fear for an hour. He is building and destroying his own empire 1,000 times a day, permanently trapped in the exhausting friction of his own static. He dies poor, entirely convinced that the universe is unfair, completely blind to the fact that his own inconstancy assassinated his destiny. The architect of the now looks at emotional fluctuation with absolute sociopathic disgust. The sovereign recognizes that motivation is an unpredictable chemical glitch. You do not build an empire on the shifting tectonic plates of how you feel. You build an empire on the cold, unmovable bedrock of acoustic constancy. To assume dictatorial control over the crystallization of matter, you must upgrade your transmission capabilities to the apex of wave physics. You must master the standing wave protocol. In the laboratory of wave mechanics, a standing wave is a miracle of geometric precision. When you send a continuous, unyielding wave down a medium, it hits a boundary and reflects back. If the frequency fluctuates even slightly, the incident wave and the reflected wave collide in a chaotic, turbulent mess. But if the frequency is held with absolute, terrifying, machine-like precision, the incoming wave and the returning wave overlap perfectly. They lock into phase. The resulting wave ceases to look like it is traveling. It freezes. It appears to stand completely still in space, vibrating with immense contained power. This is the standing wave. It is the architecture of the gods. A standing wave possesses a specific dictatorial anatomy. It is composed of antinodes and nodes. The antinodes are the points of maximum amplitude. They are the locations of extreme violent vibration. The 200 Hz biomass lives entirely in the antinodes. They are constantly moving, constantly stressed, constantly vibrating with the friction of their daily emergencies. They mistake this frantic movement for progress. But in physics, you cannot build anything in an antinode. The vibration is too violent. Any structure placed in an antinode is immediately shaken apart by the sheer chaos of the environment. The master operator does not operate in the antinodes. The master operator seeks the nodes. In a standing wave, a node is a point of absolute mathematical stillness. It is a coordinate where the incident wave and the reflected wave cancel each other's motion perfectly, creating a pocket of perfect zero displacement. The universe abhors a vacuum. The universe is desperately looking for a place of absolute stillness to deposit its infinite energy. Here is the supreme cryptographic secret of the vibrational elite. Physical matter crystallizes exclusively at the nodes. Solid reality, the multi-million-dollar contracts, the elite global alliances, the impenetrable market monopolies, is nothing more than quantum plasma that has condensed and frozen inside the still pockets of a massive standing wave. When the architect wishes to materialize an empire, he does not run into the physical world and attempt to build it with his hands. Hands are weak. Hands cause friction. The architect retreats to his anechoic chamber. He locks his internal dial to the exact frequency of his consummated victory. He emits the carrier wave of unnegotiable certainty. And he holds the note. He holds the note with a psychological rigidity that terrifies the herd. As he sustains this pure, unfluctuating signal, the standing wave forms in the electromagnetic field of his industry. The geometric scaffolding of the empire is erected in the unseen quantum layer. The nodes of absolute stillness are established. And because the standing wave is perfect, the universe has no thermodynamic alternative but to obey. The raw, unformatted plasma of global capital and human talent is gravitationally pulled into the nodes of his transmission. The resources condense, the digits hit the offshore accounts, the competitors surrender, the matter crystallizes. The empire is built with zero physical effort, strictly through the flawless application of effortless architecture. But to maintain this standing wave, you must survive the cruelty of the latency period. This is the filter that separates the true architects from the delusional amateurs. When you establish the standing wave of your empire, the quantum field obeys instantly. But the 3D hologram is dense. It is heavy. Physical matter possesses immense inertia. It takes linear time for the atoms to rearrange themselves according to your new acoustic mold. This delay is the latency period. It is the gap between the execution of the code and the final render on the screen. During the latency period, the 3D hologram will actively lie to you. The screen will show you the old data. It will show you the empty bank account. It will show you the hostile market. It will show you the exact opposite of what you are transmitting. The 200 Hz slave looks at the screen, believes the lie, and drops the frequency. He breaks the standing wave. The master operator executes tactical blindness. You must develop a sociopathic disregard for the current physical evidence. You treat the present reality as nothing more than the decaying light of a dead star. It is an echo. It has no authority over your current transmission. When the bank account says 0, you do not adjust the dial. When the client says no, you do not adjust the dial. When the entire industry laughs at your ambition, you do not adjust the dial. You deploy your internal phase-locked loop. You lock the frequency of your certainty so deeply into your nervous system that it becomes your autonomic baseline. You breathe the standing wave. You walk within the standing wave. You sleep within the standing wave. You become a tyrant of continuity. If a wave of panic attempts to infiltrate your perimeter, you isolate it in the Faraday cage, ground the energy, and return to the master frequency before the standing wave can experience a microsecond of drift. You force the universe into a war of attrition. The universe will throw friction at you to see if you will break your note. It will test the integrity of your oscillator. But because your certainty is forged from cold-rolled tungsten, you do not yield. You outlast the latency of the physical world. Eventually, the thermodynamic pressure becomes too great for the matrix to resist. The hologram violently snaps into alignment with your standing wave. The screen refreshes. The reality you held in the silence of your mind suddenly erupts into the physical plane with the terrifying force of a seismic event. The capital floods the accounts. The gatekeepers step aside. The impossible infrastructure is fully rendered, and the herd watching from the outside will call it an overnight success. They will call it luck. They will never understand that the physical manifestation was merely the final, boring formality of an acoustic war you won months ago in the dark. To execute this level of mastery, you must murder the concept of trying. Trying implies a temporary expenditure of energy followed by a retreat. Trying is a fluctuating signal. You do not try, you configure, you lock, you transmit. You must audit your daily routine and eradicate the micro-fluctuations. Stop checking your phone every 10 minutes for validation. Stop reading the news to see if the market is favorable. The market is not your master. You are the master of the market's geometry. Every time you look outside for confirmation, you introduce a wobble into your carrier wave. You blur the nodes. You slow down the crystallization process. Sever your emotional attachment to the visual feedback of the world. Treat the physical realm as an obedient, slow-moving servant that simply requires time to fetch what you have commanded. Sit in the center of your operation. Identify the exact emotional and psychological frequency of the empire you are commanding into existence. It is not the frenetic, desperate energy of the hunt. It is the heavy, settled, oceanic calm of absolute ownership. Turn the dial to that specific frequency. Push the faders to maximum amplitude. And take your hands off the console. Weld the dial in place. Let the storms of the neon cavern rage outside your perimeter. Let the weak fluctuate and perish in their own destructive interference. Let the 200 Hz slaves burn their circuits trying to build in the antinodes. You will remain in the absolute stillness of the node. You will hold the note with the chilling mechanical perfection of a god operating a rendering engine. The standing wave is established, the plasma is gathering, the crystallization is inevitable. Hold the line. Chapter 7. Destructive interference. Annulling holographic threats via phase cancellation. The idolatry of resistance is the most thermodynamically wasteful and strategically disastrous defensive protocol ever hard-coded into the biological hardware of the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he navigates the hostile topography of the neon cavern. From the earliest stages of his assembly in the factories of standard education, he has been aggressively programmed with a primitive, binary survival mechanism, the instinct to fight or flee. He is heavily indoctrinated into the cult of combat. He is taught that when the external matrix generates a high-density threat, a severe financial crisis, a vicious corporate adversary, a sudden legal entanglement, or a coordinated attack on his reputation, his absolute moral and biological duty is to fight back. He is convinced that he must brace for impact. He believes he must raise his psychological shields, tense his nervous system, and push against the crushing weight of the opposition with every single ounce of his finite kinetic strength. He believes that survival in the matrix belongs to the one who strikes the hardest. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict, unyielding physics of wave mechanics, linear superposition, and acoustic interaction. The three-dimensional universe is not a physical boxing ring. The server does not register the force of your physical muscles, nor does it care about the volume of your screaming. The external reality you inhabit is a flawless, mathematically perfect electromagnetic field. Within this field, every single threat, every crisis, and every adversary is nothing more than a specific radio frequency. They are aggressive, low-frequency carrier waves attempting to penetrate your localized airspace. When the 200 Hz slave attempts to fight a threat, he commits the ultimate act of cybernetic suicide. Let us analyze the strict mathematical telemetry of his failure. A massive crisis emerges on the horizon. The slave perceives the threat. His biological sensors trigger an alarm, flooding his system with adrenaline and cortisol. He becomes enraged. He becomes terrified. He focuses 100% of his cognitive bandwidth on the enemy. He spends his nights agonizing over the injustice of the attack. He spends his days arguing, defending himself, and projecting his desperation back at the attacker. In the pure physics of acoustics, the slave is not defending himself. He is actively feeding the monster. To understand this, we must look at the mathematical equation for a traveling wave. The hostile threat projected by the matrix can be defined by the following wave function in plain text. P threat, T, A cos. In this equation, the amplitude, represented by A, is the raw severity of the crisis. The wave number K and the angular frequency O dictate the specific nature and speed of the attack. By reacting to this threat with fear, anger, or desperate resistance, the slave's internal transmission tower begins to aggressively broadcast a signal of its own. And because his focus is entirely consumed by the threat, his biological oscillator automatically, instinctively tunes itself to the exact same frequency and phase as the attack. He is vibrating at the frequency of the crisis. He emits a reaction wave, reaction, acos. When two waves of the exact same frequency and phase collide in a medium, the principle of linear superposition dictates an inescapable catastrophic result: constructive interference. You simply add the two wave functions together. Psi total, Psi G, Psi threat, Pli, Psi T reaction, Psi G 2A cos. Look at the math. The amplitude of the problem has literally doubled. The hostile wave and the slave's terrified reaction do not cancel each other out. They merge into a single, terrifyingly powerful wave. The mathematical severity of the crisis becomes twice as dense. The adversary grows stronger, fueled by the slave's own energetic output. The legal entanglements become more suffocating. The financial loss accelerates. The slave is literally acting as a repeater tower for his own destruction. He is taking the hostile signal, amplifying it with the voltage of his own nervous system, and broadcasting it back into the hologram, solidifying the very nightmare he is desperately trying to escape. The architect of the now observes this analog combat with absolute glacial disgust. The sovereign recognizes that fighting is the sport of the powerless. Fighting implies that the enemy possesses a validity that must be contested. The master operator does not fight the matrix. The master operator does not negotiate with static. To assume dictatorial control over your localized hologram, you must upgrade your defensive hardware to the apex of telecommunications engineering. You must master the cryptography of active noise cancellation and the physics of destructive interference. In the highest echelons of aerospace engineering and combat aviation, pilots operate inside jet cockpits where the roar of the turbine engines reaches decibel levels that would permanently destroy human hearing. To protect the pilot, acoustic engineers do not simply pack the helmet with thicker layers of foam. Passive resistance is heavy, inefficient, and ultimately fails against extreme thermodynamic pressure. Instead, they deploy active noise cancellation. The mechanics of this technology represent a miracle of phase manipulation. On the outside of the pilot's headset, a highly sensitive microphone picks up the incoming sound wave of the engine roar. This acoustic data is instantly transmitted to a hyper-fast microprocessor. In a fraction of a millisecond, the processor analyzes the exact geometry of the hostile wave, its frequency, its amplitude, and its phase. Then the system executes the counterstrike. It does not try to block the noise. It generates an entirely new wave. This new wave is mathematically engineered to be the exact mirror opposite of the threat. It is an anti-phase wave. It is exactly 180 degrees or p radians out of phase with the engine roar. Where the hostile wave has a crest, the anti-phase wave has a trough. Where the hostile wave pushes, the anti-phase wave pulls. The equation for the master operator's counterwave is fundamentally different from the slave's reaction. Psi operator sin a cos e. Notice the addition of p at the end of the phase angle. This represents the 180-degree inversion. The headset fires this inverse wave directly into the pilot's ear canal alongside the incoming noise. When the hostile wave and the anti-phase wave collide in the air, the principle of superposition is applied once again, but this time the physical result is absolute, unmitigated devastation for the threat. Psi total via a cos un via zero. The positive pressure of the crest is perfectly, flawlessly annihilated by the negative pressure of the trough. The equation yields a mathematical zero. +1 and -1 equal nothing. The waves obliterate each other. The result is the holographic flatline. Despite sitting inches away from a screaming jet engine, the pilot hears nothing but pristine, immaculate, 0-Kelvin silence. The threat was not blocked. It was cancelled. This is the exact operational protocol of the vibrational elite. When the three-dimensional matrix hurls a high-density attack at your coordinates, a sudden collapse in your supply chain, a coordinated smear campaign by a competitor, or a catastrophic failure in your infrastructure, you do not run to the perimeter to fight. You do not raise your voice. You do not issue frantic press releases. You do not call your lawyers in a state of panic. You execute the active noise cancellation protocol. The first step of this protocol is the acoustic audit. You allow the threat to strike the outer hull of your Faraday perimeter. You do not absorb it. You simply measure it. You deploy your internal fast Fourier transform algorithm. In digital signal processing, a fast Fourier transform breaks down a complex chaotic signal into its pure underlying sine waves. You look at the screaming competitor or the plunging market, and you strip away the dramatic narrative. The narrative is an illusion designed to trick you into constructive interference. You isolate the raw frequency. You identify that the attack is vibrating on the bandwidth of desperation, scarcity, or aggressive panic. Once the precise frequency of the threat is acquired, you retreat to the absolute silence of your anechoic chamber. You initiate the second step, counter-encryption. You do not generate a defense. You do not generate a justification. You reach for the master console of your consciousness and you synthesize the exact 180-degree antiphase wave. If the hologram is projecting a wave of chaotic financial panic, you do not meet it with the chaotic resistance of survival. You synthesize the heavy, slow, unmovable frequency of opulent, dictatorial abundance. If a rival projects a wave of frantic, aggressive hostility, you do not meet it with anger. Anger is constructive interference. It adds to the amplitude of the hostility. You synthesize the chilling, absolute frequency of sovereign indifference. You generate the sociopathic peace of a titan who knows the insect cannot penetrate the glass of the server room. You push the faders of this antiphase emotion to their maximum amplitude. You saturate your nervous system with this inverse certainty. Your biological tower begins to transmit the cancellation signal with overwhelming nuclear wattage. You add the P to the equation, and then you execute the third step, the collision. You release the antiphase wave into the localized quantum field. You do not direct it angrily at the attacker. You simply radiate it as your baseline state of existence. The hostile wave of the crisis and the anti-phase wave of your sovereign certainty crash into each other in the unseen architecture of the matrix. Because your signal is generated with a purity and a density that the chaotic world cannot possibly match, the destructive interference is absolute. The threat is stripped of its electromagnetic oxygen. Its amplitude plummets to a mathematical zero. The physical manifestation of this phase cancellation in the three-dimensional world is baffling to the uninitiated. There is no cinematic explosion. There is no epic, exhausting final battle. The resolution is an anticlimax of terrifying precision. The enemy lawyer suddenly drops the case due to an inexplicable clerical error. The hostile takeover loses its funding overnight. The market correction inexplicably reverses just before it hits your assets. The rival who spent months plotting your downfall simply loses interest and walks away, their motivation mysteriously evaporated into the ether. The threat loses its physical coherence because you destroyed the acoustic scaffolding that was holding its atoms together. You cancelled its right to exist in your localized rendering engine. The 200 Hz biomass will demand to know how you defeated the monster without drawing your sword. They will search for the legal loopholes you exploited. They will search for the hidden capital you deployed to crush the enemy. They will never find the weapon, because the weapon was the strict absence of resistance. The weapon was a mathematical zero. To master this supreme technology, you must execute a permanent, ruthless purge of your own ego. The ego craves the friction of battle. The ego wants to be seen defending its honor. The ego wants to prove the adversary wrong in the court of public opinion. You must recognize that the desire to prove yourself right is a catastrophic security leak. It is an open port through which the enemy can inject their frequency into your server. When you argue with a fool, you have tuned your multi-million-dollar transmission tower to the frequency of a fool. You have severely degraded your own hardware just to participate in a meaningless analog skirmish. You must adopt a policy of absolute, unyielding non-engagement. When the environment attempts to provoke you, your default physical response must be silence. Not a passive, terrified silence, but the heavy, predatory silence of an active cancellation system spooling up its counterwave. If a peer insults your ambition, you do not explain your vision to them. You look at them with the blank, unreadable expression of a machine calculating a trajectory. You measure their frequency. You identify their pathetic need to drag you down to their baseline, and you emit the anti-phase wave of total irrelevance. You cancel their existence in your timeline. If an unexpected financial hemorrhage occurs, you forbid your body from accelerating its heart rate. You force your respiration into a slow, deliberate rhythm. You manually override the analog panic sequence. You identify the frequency of the loss, and you immediately radiate the crushing, inevitable frequency of exponential return. You become a black hole for hostility. Attacks go in, but no reaction ever comes out. The energy of the assault is consumed, mathematically inverted, and used to power the very silence that destroys the attacker. This requires the operational discipline of a stone leviathan. It requires you to sit in the exact eye of the hurricane, watching the debris fly past your face, entirely refusing to reach out and grab it. You must understand that the neon cavern is fundamentally a testing ground. The global matrix will continuously send diagnostic probes, disguised as crises, enemies and disasters, to measure the stability and the impedance of your signal. If you react, you fail the diagnostic. The matrix logs you as a standard 200 Hz receiver and continues to bombard you with the standard friction allocated to the slave class. But when the matrix sends its heaviest, most destructive wave, and your node registers absolutely zero fluctuation, when the matrix detects that its attacks are being perfectly annihilated by your anti-phase transmission, the underlying algorithm updates. The server recognizes that it has encountered an administrator. It stops sending the low-level noise. The friction ceases. The environment around you becomes eerily still, obedient, and perfectly aligned with your carrier wave. You have achieved the holographic flatline. You have successfully cancelled the noise of the world. Stop fighting the phantoms. Stop striking the mirrors. Retreat to the console. Read the frequency. Apply the phase inversion. Eradicate the threat with the cold, absolute geometry of your silence. The equation is balanced, the algorithm is updated, the interference is destructive. The perimeter is clear. Chapter 8. The Resonance Handshake. Bypassing the firewalls of the elite matrix. The idolatry of the analog siege is the most pathetic and energetically disastrous infiltration strategy ever hard-coded into the biological hardware of the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he attempts to navigate the highly restricted, heavily encrypted upper echelons of the neon cavern. He has been systematically indoctrinated by a civilization of outsiders to believe that the only way to access elite resources, massive venture capital, exclusive geopolitical alliances, or high-level corporate partnerships is to physically batter down the gates. He is taught the vulgar arts of networking. He is instructed to craft the perfect elevator pitch. He is told to send hundreds of cold emails, to aggressively introduce himself at events, and to persistently knock on doors until someone takes pity on his exhaustion and lets him inside. He believes that access is granted to those who push the hardest. He believes that the elite matrix rewards the volume of his desperation. He is fundamentally illiterate in the strict, unforgiving physics of advanced cybersecurity and network architecture. The highest strata of the three-dimensional universe do not operate on open servers. The global elite, the apex capital allocators, and the master architects of the market do not reside in the public domain. They exist within a closed, highly encrypted subnet, protected by an impenetrable military-grade architecture known as zero trust. In cybersecurity, a zero trust architecture operates on a single, ruthless directive. Never trust, always verify. It does not matter who you claim to be. It does not matter how loudly you knock on the port. The system treats every single external ping as a hostile threat. When the 200 Hz slave attempts his analog siege, when he aggressively pitches his idea or begs for an alliance, he is not demonstrating value. He is executing a primitive, low-budget, distributed denial-of-service attack against a server that possesses 1 trillion times his computing power. The elite gatekeepers do not listen to his words. Words are easily spoofed data. Instead, their intrusion detection systems execute a deep packet inspection on the slave's electromagnetic signature. Deep packet inspection does not just read the header of the message. It rips open the data packet and analyzes the core payload. When the elite scan the slave, they instantly detect the malware of need. They measure the high-frequency static of his desperation. They detect the parasitic oscillation of his imposter syndrome. His carrier wave is vibrating with the frantic, erratic pulse of an unshielded receiver who is terrified of rejection. The zero-trust firewall registers this emotional thermal noise as a critical security threat. The port is violently closed. The IP address is permanently blacklisted. The slave is blocked from the network, left standing in the cold, completely baffled as to why his relentless physical effort yielded absolutely zero access. He was rejected not because his idea was flawed, but because his transmission frequency triggered the perimeter alarms. The architect of the now looks at the analog siege with absolute sociopathic disgust. The sovereign recognizes that you do not batter down a firewall, you do not force a port open. Brute force is for the biological peasantry. To assume dictatorial control over the elite subnets of the global hologram, you must execute a seamless, undetectable infiltration. You must master the cryptography of the resonance handshake. In the fundamental architecture of the Internet, the transmission control protocol establishes a connection between two nodes using a precise three-step mathematical dance known as the three-way handshake. Step 1. The client sends a SYN packet to the server. Step 2. The server receives the SYN and, if the port is open and willing, replies with a SYN ACK packet. Step 3. The client receives the SYN AC and replies with a final ACK packet. Only after this silent, emotionless, perfectly timed exchange is the connection established. Only then does the firewall drop. Only then can the heavy data payload be transmitted. The master operator executes this exact protocol in the biological and corporate spheres. When you enter the perimeter of a highly guarded elite node, you do not launch into a pitch. You do not broadcast your identity. You do not emit the chaotic high-wattage noise of your ambition. You deploy absolute tactical blindness to your own ego. You silence your transmission tower. You execute the first step. You send the biological SYN packet. This is an emission of pure, unadulterated, frictionless presence. You match the baseline acoustic pressure of the room. You do not smile with the eager, pathetic servility of the 200 Hz slave. You maintain a glacial, zero-Kelvin neutrality. Your electromagnetic signature broadcasts a single, undeniable data point. I am not here to extract. Because your signal contains absolutely zero thermal noise, zero desperation, and zero need for validation, it glides right through the outer filters of the target's intrusion detection system. It does not trigger the alarm because it does not carry the signature of a parasite. The elite target, the billionaire, the gatekeeper, the apex predator of the industry, receives your SYN packet. Their subconscious network scans your frequency and finds nothing but the heavy, dense, unmovable tungsten of peer-level sovereignty. Their hardware recognizes you as a compatible node. They execute the second step. They send the SYNAC. In the physical hologram, this manifests as the target dropping their guard. The cold, defensive posture of the gatekeeper relaxes. They initiate contact. They ask you a question. They invite you to speak. They open the port. This is the exact millisecond where the amateur fails. When the 200 Hz slave accidentally receives a SYNAC from an elite node, his system experiences a catastrophic thermal runaway. He gets excited. His heart rate spikes. His ego screams in triumph. He instantly dumps his entire chaotic payload of ideas, needs, and pitches into the newly opened port. The target's firewall immediately detects the sudden spike in thermal noise, registers the bait and switch, and violently severs the connection. The slave is ejected. The architect of the now never breaks protocol. When you receive the SYN ACK from the elite matrix, your internal temperature remains at absolute zero. You do not celebrate. You do not accelerate your speech. You maintain the flawless, sociopathic discipline of a machine. You execute the final step. You send the ACK. You deliver a brief, perfectly calibrated response that acknowledges their signal without giving away an ounce of your own power. You mirror their density. You confirm the synchronization. The handshake is complete. The connection is established. The elite firewall powers down. You are now inside the zero-trust network. You are operating behind the enemy lines of the hologram's most guarded sectors. But to survive inside the subnet and extract the multi-million-dollar payload, you must implement MAC spoofing and cryptographic camouflage. In network security, a media access control address is the unique hardware identifier of a device. Network administrators use MAC filtering to ensure that only specific trusted devices can access the server. MAC spoofing is the technique of masking your own hardware address and replacing it with the exact address of a trusted device already on the network. The elite matrix operates on severe biological MAC filtering. They only trust their own kind. They only do business with those who possess the exact same frequency of wealth, power, and emotional detachment. If you walk into their subnet broadcasting your true original identity, your humble beginnings, your struggles, your unique, quirky personality, you will trigger the internal security protocols. Individuality is an analog concept. It is a vulnerability. The master operator has no attachment to his personality. Your personality is merely an interface, a user-selectable skin that can be swapped out depending on the network you are hacking. When you are inside the elite subnet, you execute MAC spoofing. You become an acoustic mirror. You scan the specific frequency of the target. You analyze their pacing, their vocabulary, their emotional baseline, and their unstated assumptions about the universe. And you perfectly, seamlessly modulate your own carrier wave to match their exact impedance. You do not agree with them to flatter them. Flattery is the frequency of a subordinate. You align with them with the cold, undeniable authority of a peer who arrived at the exact same conclusions independently. Because your frequency perfectly matches their trusted internal network, their subconscious mind cannot differentiate between your thoughts and their own. This is the apex of cyber-social infiltration. Once you are fully camouflaged within their system, you do not sell your alliance or your project. Selling implies a transfer of goods across a border, but you are already inside the border. Instead, you execute a firmware overwrite. You plant the data packets of your vision, the merger, the capital allocation, the strategic pivot, directly into their local servers. Because your frequency is perfectly synchronized with theirs, they do not perceive your idea as a foreign invasion. They perceive it as an internal system update. They will look at your proposal and believe it was the logical culmination of their own genius. They will fund your empire because their compromised operating system tells them it is the only mathematically viable option for their own survival. You have hacked the highest nodes in the matrix without ever raising your voice. You bypassed the guards, circumvented the zero-trust architecture, spoofed the hardware filters, and overwrote the root directory of the global elite, all through the terrifying, silent application of the resonance handshake. To maintain this supreme level of access, you must permanently eradicate the victory ping. When a hacker successfully breaches a system, the most common way they are caught is by transmitting a victory ping back to their own servers, generating anomalous outbound traffic that alerts the network administrators. When you close the impossible deal, when the elite gatekeeper hands you the keys to the kingdom, you must suppress the biological urge to celebrate. You do not smile with relief. You do not let your heart rate accelerate. You do not alter your carrier wave. If you show relief, you prove that you were desperate. If you show excitement, you prove that you did not belong there. The sudden spike in emotional voltage will trigger the elite's post-breach detection systems. They will realize they have been hacked. They will freeze the capital. they will sever the contract. The master operator accepts the millions, the power, and the alliance with the chilling, dead-eyed apathy of an ATM dispensing cash. It is merely a transaction of data. It was mathematically inevitable. There is nothing to celebrate. You maintain the spoofed MAC address. You sustain the standing wave of your camouflage. You walk out of the boardroom, out of the elite subnet, and back into the neon cavern without leaving a single cryptographic fingerprint on the server. The capital is yours. The network is compromised. The hologram has been rewritten. This is the physics of true infiltration. The doors of the world are not locked. They are simply encrypted. Silence your transmitter. Mask your signature. Execute the handshake. Chapter 9. Ionospheric reflection. Bouncing the master signal across the global grid. The idolatry of physical presence is the most thermodynamically catastrophic limitation adopted by the emerging elite of the human species. Observe the middle strata of the neon cavern. In this specific altitude of the matrix, we do not find the absolute failures or the hopelessly poor. We find an invisible, highly active graveyard filled with individuals who managed to escape the baseline poverty of the 200 Hz herd, but who tragically perished before reaching true, frictionless sovereignty. These are the individuals who learned how to turn on their transmission tower. They learned the basics of the execution code. They emitted a decent signal and successfully attracted capital, status, and corporate victories. But they were victims of a scalability error so primitive, so utterly analog, that it permanently fried their biological circuits. These individuals are indoctrinated into the cult of continuous kinetic effort. They believe the toxic narrative of hustle culture and micromanagement. They are absolutely convinced that because their physical voice, their personal charisma, and their direct manual labor built their initial empire, they must continue to physically supervise every single atom of their creation. They believe they must be in every room, approve every document, and personally fight every battle. We shall call this pathology of absolute centralization the interference of the local short circuit. Under the suffocating, crushing pressure of this physical limitation operates an evolved but hopelessly trapped version of our standard specimen, the local announcer. Observe the topographical X-ray of his exhaustion from the cold isolation of the telecommunications server room. The local announcer has built a prosperous business or a highly recognized personal brand. He possesses a transmission tower, but he operates it manually. He is the bottleneck of his own success. He works 18 hours a day. His cellular structure is decaying. His nervous system is chronically inflamed. He is terrified of stepping away from the control console for even a single day, because he knows that the moment he stops speaking into the microphone, his entire network goes dead. He is a slave who successfully purchased a larger, more expensive cage. He is the master of a kingdom that strictly depends on the continuous deterioration of his own biological lungs. He is fundamentally illiterate in the advanced physics of over-the-horizon transmission and network scalability. The architect of the now looks at the exhausting, hyperactive lifestyle of the local announcer with absolute glacial disgust. The sovereign recognizes that your physical body is the most inefficient, fragile, and geographically limited piece of hardware in your entire arsenal. If your empire requires your physical presence to generate capital, you do not own an empire. You own a high-stress biological labor camp. To assume dictatorial control over the global grid, You must aggressively separate your cognitive genius from the wear and tear of your physical vehicle. You must upgrade your transmission architecture from localized line-of-sight propagation to the staggering world-bending physics of ionospheric reflection. We must first analyze the fatal limitation of frequency modulation and line-of-sight broadcasting. FM radio stations broadcast at very high frequencies. The audio quality is exceptionally clear, and the data transfer is fast. However, high-frequency waves travel in a strictly straight line. They cannot bend around obstacles. They cannot curve around the Earth. If a mountain stands between the FM transmitter and the receiver, the signal dies. Because the Earth is a sphere, the curvature of the planet forces the straight FM wave to simply shoot off into empty space after a few dozen miles. The local announcer operates strictly in FM. His signal is high quality, but its range is pathetic. It only reaches the people he can physically see, the employees in his immediate office, or the clients he directly speaks to. His influence is brutally amputated by the physical geometry of his local environment. The master operator refuses to be constrained by the curvature of the Earth or the limitations of his biological geography. The master operator shifts his carrier wave to amplitude modulation and exploits the skywave. High above the surface of the Earth, stretching into the vacuum of space, lies the ionosphere. It is a massive layer of atmospheric gas that is continuously bombarded and ionized by the extreme radiation of the sun. This layer is highly charged with free electrons and ions. In radio physics, when you broadcast a specific low-frequency AM wave, it does not travel in a straight line into the void. It travels upward, strikes the charged plasma of the ionosphere, and undergoes a violent refraction. The ionosphere acts as a colossal planetary mirror. It bounces the radio wave back down to Earth. The signal strikes the ground thousands of miles away from the transmitter. It bounces off the ocean, strikes the ionosphere again, and continues to zigzag across the globe. This is skywave propagation. It is the physics of how a single transmission tower in a dark, isolated field can be heard clearly on the opposite side of the planet. To achieve skywave propagation in the architecture of your empire, you must extract your master code from your biological body and encode it into automated, self-sustaining systems. You must execute the protocol of the sovereign network. The local announcer relies on his personality. Personality cannot be scaled. It cannot be bounced off the ionosphere. The sovereign relies on pure, unemotional, mathematical procedure. You retreat to your anechoic chamber, and you perform a ruthless audit of your daily kinetic actions. You look at the decisions you make, the quality control you enforce, and the standard of excellence you demand. You strip away the emotional context, and you distill your exact operational frequency into hard-coded algorithms, rigid corporate protocols, and inviolable standard operating procedures. You write the blueprint of your unyielding will. Once your frequency is extracted and documented, you must erect repeater towers. In a global telecommunications grid, a repeater tower is a subordinate device designed to receive a faint signal, amplify it with fresh electrical power, and retransmit it to the next sector without altering a single byte of the original data. In the 3D hologram of your empire, your employees, your automated software, your legal representatives, and your strategic alliances are your repeater towers. The 200 Hz biomass fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of a team. The herd believes a team is a family. They believe a corporation is a democracy where everyone contributes their unique perspective. They hire people and ask them for their creative input, injecting dozens of different conflicting frequencies into the master signal. The architect of the now operates a dictatorship of frequency. Your repeater towers are not hired to be original. They are not authorized to be creative with your core protocol. They are installed for one singular mathematical purpose: to receive your exact carrier wave, amplify it with their kinetic energy, and execute it across the global grid exactly as you designed it. You do not want their unique spin on your vision. Their unique spin is analog static. Their personal opinions are parasitic noise. When you configure your network of repeater towers, you must establish an ironclad phase-locked loop. Every single tower in your network must be perfectly synchronized with the central oscillator, which is you. If an automated system, a contractor, or an executive begins to drift from your baseline frequency, if they begin to introduce the malware of compromise, the static of laziness, or the thermal noise of their own ego into your network, you must execute immediate network pruning. The local announcer fails because he feels empathy for a malfunctioning tower. He tries to rehabilitate the employee. He tries to argue with the software vendor. He spends hours of his own precious bandwidth trying to repair a node that is actively degrading his global broadcast. The master operator does not rehabilitate hardware. If a repeater tower distorts the master signal, you cut the power. You sever the connection. You amputate the node from the network with the chilling, instantaneous speed of a digital guillotine. You replace the tower. There is no warning. There is no emotional exit interview. The integrity of the skywave is absolute, and any component that causes destructive interference must be immediately purged from the server. When you enforce this level of zero-tolerance network hygiene, a terrifying and beautiful phenomenon occurs: acoustic omnipresence. Because your algorithms are flawless, and because your repeater towers are perfectly phase-locked to your intent, you no longer need to be in the room. You can remain in the total isolation of your central base. You can place your physical body into a state of deep rest, cooling your biological reactor, while the massive, automated architecture of your network continues to bounce your intent off the ionosphere of the global market. Your legal software aggressively secures patents on the other side of the planet. Your capital is allocated by algorithms that perfectly mimic your sociopathic risk tolerance. Your marketing funnels broadcast the heavy dictatorial gravity of your brand to millions of screens simultaneously, 24 hours a day, without demanding a single calorie of effort from your physical lungs. The 200 Hz slaves will look at your exponential expansion, and they will be paralyzed by incomprehension. They will calculate the sheer volume of output your empire is generating, and they will assume you are working 1,000 hours a week. They will assume you have sacrificed sleep, health, and sanity. They will try to compete with you by working harder, by sleeping less, by burning their biological engines until they literally collapse in the dirt. They are trying to fight a global radio broadcast with their bare fists. They do not understand that the master operator is not doing the heavy lifting. The master operator is simply the cold, silent intelligence sitting at the center of the console, ensuring the transmitter is powered and the frequency is pure. The network is doing the lifting. The ionosphere is distributing the weight. The automated architecture is executing the friction. To achieve this, you must permanently murder your martyr complex. The universe does not care how tired you are. The 3D rendering engine does not care how many hours you stayed awake looking at spreadsheets. Exhaustion is not a currency. It is a penalty for bad engineering. The matrix only respects the scale, the purity, and the unyielding continuity of the wave. Look at your hands. Look at your daily schedule. If you are spending your bandwidth on repetitive mechanical tasks that could be executed by a line of code or a standardized subordinate, you are insulting your own architecture. You are using a multi-million-dollar quantum telecommunications array to sweep the floor. You must forbid yourself from operating in local FM. You must reject the primitive satisfaction of physical exhaustion. Extract your source code, build the repeater towers, demand absolute synchronization, turn up the voltage. Bounce your unmovable certainty off the highest layers of the atmosphere, and let the global grid rain your sovereign intent upon every coordinate of the map. You are no longer an individual struggling against the world. You are the infrastructure. You are the supreme broadcasting network. Scale the wave. Transmit to the horizon. Chapter 10. Acoustic Multiplexing and the Mastery of Multiple Timelines. The idolatry of sacrifice is the final, most fatal algorithmic limitation programmed into the biological hardware of the human species. Observe the 200 Hz inertial slave as he approaches the absolute apex of the neon cavern. Even those who have managed to escape the baseline poverty of the masses and acquired a rudimentary understanding of frequency transmission are eventually destroyed by this obsolete software. They have been systematically indoctrinated by a civilization of martyrs to believe in the thermodynamic illusion of the zero-sum game. They are convinced that the universe possesses a strictly limited bandwidth, and therefore supreme success requires a brutal, corresponding blood tribute. The slave believes that to achieve absolute financial dominance, he must systematically destroy his biological health. He believes that to secure an elite corporate empire, he must sacrifice his personal alliances and his mental equilibrium. He views his life as a primitive analog control board where pushing one fader up automatically forces another fader down. We shall call this cybernetic delusion the interference of signal fragmentation. Under the guillotine of this defective programming operates a tragic, exhausted specimen, the fragmented receiver. Observe the telemetry of his agony from the cold isolation of the telecommunications server room. The fragmented receiver has learned to tune into the frequency of capital. He turns on his transmission tower, and the financial matter begins to crystallize in his accounts. But because his internal software dictates that he cannot have everything, his biological hardware begins to fail. His nervous system collapses under the stress. When he realizes his health is failing, he panics. He violently rips the dial away from the frequency of wealth and tunes into the frequency of biological survival. He attempts to heal his body, but because he abandoned the financial frequency, his corporate empire begins to hemorrhage capital. He is a frantic, terrified juggler, constantly dropping one glass sphere to catch another, running back and forth across his own control room, desperately trying to keep the fractured pieces of his reality from crashing into the dirt. He is fundamentally illiterate in the advanced physics of broadband optical networks and wave superposition. The three-dimensional rendering engine does not require your sacrifice. The quantum field does not operate on a deficit. The universe possesses infinite, unmetered bandwidth. The limitation is not in the server. The limitation is strictly in the primitive, analog routing protocols of the slave's mind. The architect of the now looks at the exhausting, fragmented theater of the zero-sum game with absolute glacial disgust. The sovereign recognizes that you do not time-share your reality. You do not alternate between health, wealth, and power. To assume dictatorial control over all vectors of your existence simultaneously, you must upgrade your transmission architecture to the absolute apex of telecommunications engineering. You must master the physics of acoustic multiplexing. In the early primitive days of analog telephony, a single copper wire could only carry one conversation at a time. This was a severe limitation of physical infrastructure. If two people were speaking on the line, the third had to wait. The fragmented receiver operates his life on this obsolete copper wire. He uses time division multiplexing. He gives 12 hours of his bandwidth to his business, effectively pausing his health and his relationships. He then gives 2 hours to his health, pausing his business. He is constantly dividing his finite timeline, slicing his kinetic energy into thinner and thinner fractions until he is completely dissolved. The master operator eradicates the copper wire. You must transmute your cognitive architecture into military-grade fiber optics and execute wavelength division multiplexing. In modern optical networks, engineers discovered a universe-breaking geometric truth. Light waves of different frequencies do not interfere with each other, even when they occupy the exact same physical space at the exact same time. By using WDM technology, a single microscopic strand of fiber optic glass can simultaneously transmit hundreds of different data streams. One stream is blue light, carrying a massive financial transaction. Another stream is red light, carrying a high-definition video feed. Another stream is green light, carrying classified military encryption. They all travel down the exact same cable at the exact same millisecond, at the speed of light, overlapping perfectly without ever causing a single microsecond of destructive interference. You must execute wavelength division multiplexing in your own nervous system. You must abandon the frantic analog habit of switching your attention between your different goals. You do not transmit the frequency of wealth on Monday, the frequency of power on Tuesday, and the frequency of health on Wednesday. You retreat to your anechoic chamber. You initiate the complete isolation of your circuitry, and you begin to synthesize the master carrier wave. You take the specific, dense frequency of elite generational wealth. You take the pure, frictionless frequency of indestructible biological health. You take the heavy, chilling frequency of absolute market dominance. You do not switch between them, you stack them. In the physics of wave mechanics, this is known as the principle of superposition. When multiple waves travel through the same medium, the total displacement is the exact mathematical sum of the individual waves. You force these distinct frequencies to overlap in the core of your consciousness. You compress them. You fuse them together under the catastrophic lithostatic pressure of your unyielding discipline. When you synthesize these frequencies perfectly, they merge into a single, unified transmission. They become a laser of pure, blinding white light. White light is not a single color. It is the absolute, simultaneous presence of every color in the visible spectrum. The master carrier wave is not a single desire. It is the absolute, simultaneous presence of your entire consummated empire. You lock this white light frequency into your phase-locked loop. You encode it into your blood, your posture, and your breathing. You emit this master carrier wave 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without a single micro fluctuation. And then you direct this transmission into the 3D rendering engine. When your unified multiplexed signal hits the external matrix, the universe acts as an optical prism. When a beam of pure white light strikes a glass prism, the geometry of the prism forces the light to refract. The single beam is violently split back into its constituent frequencies, projecting a massive, expanded spectrum of individual colors onto the physical environment. This is the supreme, terrifying mechanics of your effortless omnipresence. You do not need to physically run around the matrix trying to build each individual pillar of your life. You simply sit in the center of your operation, perfectly still, radiating the unified master carrier wave. The 3D hologram receives your white light transmission and acts as the prism. The universe automatically passes the data streams. The rendering engine refracts your signal and executes the physical manifestation on all fronts simultaneously. The red stream of the multiplexed signal strikes the global economy, and the capital floods into your offshore accounts. The blue stream strikes your biological vehicle, and your cellular structure optimizes, achieving ruthless, frictionless health. The green stream strikes your corporate network, and your competitors inexplicably surrender their market share. Everything happens at once. The execution is parallel, not serial. Because you are no longer a fragmented receiver dividing your limited bandwidth, you experience no latency between the victories. The financial expansion does not cost you your physical vitality. The absolute power does not cost you your peace. The 200 Hz biomass will observe this multi-dimensional dominance, and their processing cores will melt. They will look at the sheer, terrifying scope of your reality. They will see that you possess the wealth of a tyrant, the physical resilience of a machine, and the icy, undisturbed tranquility of a vacuum. They will try to calculate the amount of physical labor required to achieve this, and their math will fail. They will assume you have discovered a dark secret. They will assume you have a hidden army of laborers doing the work for you. They will try to copy your daily routine, waking up earlier, working longer, sacrificing more of their blood, trying to beat the zero-sum game through sheer analog attrition. They are trying to push an ocean through a copper wire. They will drown in their own friction. They will never understand that the master operator does not push. The master operator multiplexes. To sustain this apex architecture, you must ruthlessly enforce the death of the analog clock. Time, as perceived by the herd, is a sequence of isolated events. It is a linear track. The master operator views time as a simultaneous acoustic field. When you lock onto the master carrier wave, you step outside the linear progression of the slaves. You do not wait for the future to render your empire piece by piece. You declare the total synthesis in the absolute present millisecond. You speak the root command I am strictly as a multidimensional mandate. I am the unified architecture of this reality. When a parasitic thought attempts to infiltrate your perimeter, a sudden whisper of doubt suggesting that you cannot have it all, that you must sacrifice one asset to protect another, you must recognize it as the highest level malware in the neon cavern. It is an attack designed to shatter your prism. It is designed to force you back into time division multiplexing. You deploy the active noise cancellation protocol we established. You isolate the frequency of the doubt. You synthesize the exact anti-phase wave of your dictatorial certainty, and you annihilate the intrusion before it can decouple your data streams. You protect the white light with the sociopathic violence of a military firewall. You are no longer an individual navigating a complex world. You have transcended the limitations of the biological node. You have become the supreme multidimensional router. Look at the fragments of your ambition. Look at the isolated goals you thought you had to chase one by one. Gather them, compress them, synthesize the wave. Turn off the copper wire. Ignite the fiber optic core. Transmit the total spectrum. The hologram is rendering. The timelines have merged. Conclusion: the thermodynamic finality of the sovereign. The transmission is complete. The source code has been permanently injected into your biological hardware. The neon cavern, with its deafening static, its engineered panics, and its endless supply of 200 Hz victims, will continue to hum outside your perimeter. The herd will continue to worship the illusion of physical friction. They will continue to bleed their kinetic energy into a blind, unfeeling server that only rewards them with more exhaustion. They will remain forever trapped in the analog tragedy of the receiver. That is no longer your trajectory. You have been systematically stripped of your acoustic vulnerabilities. You have dismantled the naked antenna of your empathy and replaced it with the cold, impenetrable titanium of the Faraday perimeter. You have eradicated the parasitic oscillation of your internal monologue, weaponizing the root command of your own existence. You have ceased to argue with the hologram, mastering the ruthless elegance of destructive interference and phase cancellation. You no longer hunt the data streams of global capital. You have executed the BGP hijack, becoming the frictionless fiber optic node through which the world's wealth is mathematically forced to route. This is the physics of your new reality. It requires no faith. It requires no motivation. It strictly requires the sociopathic maintenance of your internal frequency. When you close this transmission, the 3D rendering engine will attempt to test your new architecture. It will send a diagnostic probe, a minor crisis, a hostile variable, a sudden delay in the latency period. Do not blink. Do not adjust the dial. Retreat to the dead air of your anechoic chamber. Lock the phase-locked loop. Embody the heavy absolute 0 Kelvin stillness of the node. Remember that physical matter can only crystallize in the absence of vibration. Let the universe crash against your hull. Let the matrix bend to the undeniable, terrifying gravity of your standing wave. The era of the hunt is permanently terminated. You are the infrastructure. You are the master oscillator. Hold the note, rule the frequency.